Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about the second of our GBG hitting protocols, and that is getting into and maintaining a good scap load. There'll be a little crossover here with some of the things we talked about in the get to launch protocol, but getting into a good scap load and holding it is really an important part of our sequencing as a player, and something that sets us up for success down the line as we move up the kinetic chain. So we're going to take some time and talk about a couple different aspects of this, how we get into it, how we try and maintain it, and some visual examples of how some of the best in the game do it.
So the first thing I want to do is just make sure everyone understands exactly what the scap is. Our scapula bone is commonly referred to as the shoulder blade. It's basically a flat triangular bone right at the back of the shoulder, usually about the size of your hand or so. Different players are going to have different levels of mobility in their scap. That's something we may actually start to assess next year. We see this with pitchers as well. So what we want to try and make sure we're doing as coaches here is describing this in a way that's easy for the player to understand. I've read the actual sequence of how the muscles work from scap load to basically to contact, and it's incredibly complex. It gave me a headache. So when we want to talk to players about this for younger players, I like to use the analogy of throwing a punch. And basically, what we're doing as a hitter is getting that scap bone in our top hand, our back arm, basically to retract towards the spine. So if you can picture that red outlined area there on the right on the right arm of that hitter retracting towards the spine, that's basically going to stretch the muscles around that. And like I said, for the younger players, I think it's really throwing that punch or winding up to throw a punch is a really easy way to understand it. They're going to feel that pinch, and then if you actually go ahead and have them throw a punch, they're going to feel that the rotational action of those moves is very similar. So I think it's a great way for young players to understand it. With some of our intermediate to older guys, I use the term set and anchor. So it's kind of the same concept as we're trying to get into that load to set an anchor for our top half to resist our lower half's turn. I use that term a little bit more with our older guys because I think it helps them think about, like I said, the resisting the turn a little bit, as opposed to the more remedial version of throwing the punch. And then with some of our older guys, we'll get into it a little bit more in depth of what we're trying to do. But I think it's important to understand exactly what's happening and be able to explain it in a very simple way to our players.
So why are we loading into our scap? I think that's an important question. A couple of big reasons. Number one, we're trying to create that stretch in our core. We talked about this a little bit with the Mookie Betts example with generating a little bit of that cross-body energy. I like to talk to kids about picturing an elastic band and pulling it tight. And when they release it, the tighter they pull it, the faster it explodes through. So we want to create a stretch in our core that when that begins to rotate, we have a lot of energy there. Promote good sequencing. This is maybe the most important reason. We like to talk about the scap load as basically setting an anchor for our top half. So we can picture that scap bone moving towards the spine a little bit. Now it allows our lower half to rotate while our top half resists initially. We'll talk about that a lot later in the presentation, but that's one of the most important reasons. And really what it does is it prevents compensating patterns like the front shoulder opening early to help rotation. And another common one we see is guys getting really handsy when they're not engaged in their scap. Basically, their lower half and top half working at the same time, which results in a loss of energy and kind of a pushy, handsy swing. And another one of the big ones for me is it helps get our barrel on plane early, which is really important, especially as these guys get older and start seeing good velocity, guys who can locate and good off-speed pitches. If you see just our visuals on the right here, just a couple of the muscles we use in our back. Once that scap load is engaged, our serratus anterior and our oblique muscles play a big factor. And if you take a look in the bottom right, this is kind of our visual of how we want to kind of take the slack out is the term I used in our get to launch protocols in terms of creating that tension and building that energy in our muscles. That rope you see attached to the bone there, picture that as your muscles, and you see how it lays loose on the bone initially, and when we get into our scap load, we see that rope tighten, and now we put our body in a position to be much more explosive. So the next thing I want to talk about is how exactly we are trying to get loaded into our scap. It's a couple different ways. The simplest explanation for me is if you watch Gonzalez here on the left, is you're just kind of rowing that back elbow towards the opposite dugout. Like I said, the throw the punchy analogy, starting up a lawnmower, whatever you want to think about. One thing, we talked about it a little bit, we'll expand on it later, is how much each player is going to have to load into that scap is a little bit different. I've had some of the hitters that I've worked with a long time. We've kind of experimented with where we need to get to feel that adequate stretch, and that's going to depend on each individual hitter. One thing I also like here about Gonzalez is I get a lot of guys who almost push their hands back. I've always been a really top hand oriented guy when I talk hitting. And what I want you to watch here is Gonzalez almost seems to me like he's loading with just his top hand, rowing that elbow back, which prevents that bottom hand from pushing. And what you'll see from a lot of guys is they push with that bottom hand, and their front arm gets locked out and they lose adjustability, and it could affect them as we go through the later part of our sequence. So like I said, I like Gonzalez a lot. There's two different ways we can kind of think about our scap load. Is we have guys like Trout who gets into it kind of early in his gather and then holds it. And then you have a guy like Gonzalez, or if you watch JD Martinez, they're guys who kind of have this constant stretch, constantly moving backwards until it's go time. So there's two different ways to do it. My preference is to keep guys moving with some rhythm up there. And one of the biggest issues I see with guys who come out of their scap early is that they tend to get in it early and come out of it early. So just a good visual from Gonzalez there on the one on the right here. You can see kind of an overhead view of what happens with that elbow. But a good way to think about it is just slow and smooth. And like I said, just make sure the player understands his options of, let's go back a little sooner and work to hold it, or let's go back later and then snap right from there. A couple of good visuals for you here. Mookie Betts, one of the probably an outlier in baseball with how mobile and flexible he is. You're going to see that he's in a position right now where his belt buckle is pretty much pointed at second base. So we know his pelvis has already started to rotate, but you can see that as he's already beginning to rotate, that he still remains engaged in that scap. And you can see the wrinkles in his jersey here. Okay, that's kind of the tension we were talking about in terms of building that stretch to create some energy once we begin rotation with the top half. And like I said, Mookie's kind of a freak with the ability to do this, but guys who are able to hold in their scap as the lower half rotates are going to generate more energy and be more adjustable too. Mookie's able to keep his hands back here and stay engaged in his scap. So if his lower half begins rotation a little bit early, he's able to hold back and adjust to an off-speed pitch. On the right, you're going to see Aaron Judge, who has a much smaller move. Obviously, these guys have different body types, but this is a good example of a front view where we can see mostly just the first number on Judge's jersey there in the first frame, and then in the second frame when he's in his scap load, now we can see both numbers on his jersey, and you can kind of see his hands in the picture on the left, and obviously we can't see them in the picture on the right since he is loaded into his scap. So we're going to watch two different type of movers here. You see Cam on the left, long, lanky, still young, growing into his body a little bit, and then JD on the right, a much tighter mover, more compact body type, a little bit older. This is something we may actually do next year, is start to classify guys as on a spectrum from loose to tight movers, because it does affect exactly what we want them to do. So Cam being 6'2", 150 pounds, and probably growing an inch every 3 weeks. For him, if we picture that rope we talked about in one of the first slides about having to tighten our rope before we can kind of unleash that energy. One other analogy I use often is to think about a rope attached to the front of a car, and we have to pull that car up a hill. Initially, when we pick up the rope, it has slack in it. And basically, what we're trying to do is when we first go to pull that car, the rope tightens first and then the car moves. Okay, so for Cam, his rope is longer. Okay, so he has to have a little bit of a bigger move to create that stretch. Where a guy like JD, who's more compact, he's tighter. He doesn't need as big a move to create an adequate stretch. So this is something, like I said, that as a coach, we can't just put guys in these huge buckets. We have to kind of try and break them down from there. And there's going to be guys who fall more towards the middle of the spectrum. So just a few things for loose movers. Like I said, they generally have bigger moves. And quite frankly, they have more difficulty repeating them because of the range of motion that they have. So you'll see loose movers, I'd say, maybe have a higher ceiling in terms of how hard they can hit the ball, but it's a little bit harder for those guys to repeat it from swing to swing, from game to game, weekend to weekend. These guys might be some of the guys you've coached over the years who get red hot for a couple weekends and then are nowhere to be found for a couple like that. And this is very common for our younger players to fall more towards the loose end of the spectrum. When we did our on-base U mobility screens, it got to the point where we could pretty much predict based on age who was going to pass mobility tests and who was going to fail stability tests. And generally, what we saw is younger, looser players passing all the mobility tests and failing the stability, where the tight guys tend to do better in the creating stability but have difficulty with mobility. And both of those are important. I think from a coaching perspective, though, it's important to identify which is which, where these guys fall, and that'll help you guys kind of help them understand how big of a move they need to make when getting into that scap load. So now we've set our anchor up top. This to me here is the move that separates elite hitters. And quite frankly, we don't have a ton of guys who do this really well in our program, but I think we're trending in that direction. It's a difficult move, but something that we've done a lot of drill work on this winter to try and ingrain in these kids, and hopefully as they all get bigger and stronger as they get older, it gets a little bit easier to make this. So you're going to see Hosmer and Pujols here, and what I like to see is basically you're going to see both of their pelvises start rotation while they maintain their scap load for a half a second. And what that does is you'll see the wrinkles on the back of their jersey there. And like I said, we're creating that tension and stretching those muscles to a point where they're ready to explode. And this is a really good visual of the top half resisting the lower half's turn initially and only for a fraction of a second. And if you watch both of their back elbows start to slot in, if we went a couple frames more, we're going to start to see that barrel work back a little bit. And this is the move to me that creates that natural swing depth. You can see that this move kind of creates that barrel layback. So what basically happens is our humerus, our arm bone, goes into external rotation as we start to slot that elbow in. That top hand wrist starts to supinate, and that's basically us getting in to our palms up position. And once we're in that palm up position, now we're generating bat speed slightly up to the ball, which is where we want to be. So this move right here for me is what separates elite hitters, is the ability to generate more energy from that core, to get on plane early, to stay connected to our turn, and give ourselves a much bigger margin for error this way in terms of how long the bat stays in the strike zone. A couple examples here of guys slotting in and getting on plane. You're going to see both their elbows are slotted in. At this point, we want to see close to a straight line from their back hip up through their elbow and their hands. These guys are pretty close to that. And you're going to see the next two frames probably. These guys would start that knob working up to the ball. So this is when you hear players and coaches talk about swinging down to the ball. I think this is probably maybe the part of the swing they think about. But the next couple frames, that knob's going to start working on playing with the ball, and that top hand wrist begins to get into full supination as we start to deliver the barrel. So just a couple of visual examples from the side of a couple of our Hawks hitters who do a pretty good job of rotating those hips and then slotting that elbow in. You see how well connected those guys are to their turn, which gives them a lot of energy as well. These two guys here, we're going to see guys who are not in their scap properly, and we see two different compensating patterns here. On the left, this player not really getting into an adequate scap load, and what happens now is his hips and hands are almost going at the same time, and you're going to see that his hands are working down to the ball and in a much steeper path to the ball. So we found a lot of our guys who we classify as handsy or pushy or do too much of that knob down to the ball stuff. I know that I was taught growing up. It's usually from them not engaging their scap well, not creating that elbow slot on time where we need it to, not allowing that palm to get up and not allowing us to generate momentum up towards the ball. We can see here that bat's going to be slicing down through the zone. We're going to get a lot of ground balls here. The hitter on the right, you're going to see that elbow more in front of his hands at this position. This is a common one we see as well is guys who don't engage in their scap. Now their elbow starts to slot in really early, and they're essentially pulling the bat through the strike zone, which often ends up with guys cutting down to the ball, which we see here a little bit, and also cutting through the zone horizontally as well, because their sequencing is out of whack due to that elbow slotting in really early from an inefficient scap load. This is the action we kind of want to see after that elbow slots in. Like I said, that palm starts to work up as we deliver the barrel. You can see these guys both at contact. These are both well-struck baseballs in the air. That both of these guys are still in their palm up position. You see Isig there on the right making a little bit of an adjustment, trying to maintain his spacing with his top half. But you can see both their elbows are still pretty close to their body. They're connected from where that elbow slotted in properly, and now they're able to deliver the barrel to the ball with their palm up. And both of these guys are going to pronate that top hand probably in the next couple frames. But this position here where we're at palms up at contact and hopefully a couple of frames through the baseball allows us to deliver the bat to the ball with good spin. A lot of guys that cut across the ball or aren't able to keep that palm up due to the inadequate scap load, they end up rolling over, hitting the ball with a lot of top spin and side spin to the pull side. These guys are both very good at pulling the ball in the air, which is one of the main measurements of an elite hitter. And one of the big reasons is that they deliver the barrel with that palm up, getting the barrel accelerating up to the ball and generating good spin on the ball so that we're able to beat some guys in the outfield over their heads. So you see the result of our inadequate scap load guys as they start to deliver the barrel to the ball. This is a pretty common finishing position for guys who can't maintain that palm up position. So you'll see that both of them have pronated that top wrist much earlier than the two in the video before, and it doesn't take a hitting instructor to know that this is going to result in a lot of rollovers to the left side. getting jammed on a lot of balls, rolling over, popping up to the right side, and inconsistency making quality contact. I had a player years ago at Foxborough High who was a really good athlete and great hand-eye guy and found a lot of barrels. And he asked me one day why he never hit home runs, and I showed him a picture of the finish of his swing, and it looked like this. And that was really the reason is if we can't deliver the ball to the pull side with good spin, we're not going to be able to hit the ball for extra base hits. And like I said, one of the common features of elite hitters is being able to pull the ball in the air really well. One, because it's where we can do the most damage, but two, it's a sign that we're doing a lot of things really well as a hitter. We're sequencing well, we're staying connected well, we're delivering the barrel with the palm up, staying through the ball with good direction. As much as we want to be a versatile hitter and use the whole field, pulling the ball in the air is a good indicator that we're doing a lot of things well. So we'll get now to some drills we can do in terms of correcting some of these things. The one on the left, you see Brennan going through the PVC scap load, and Matt on the right going through our J-band scap load. And these are pretty similar drills depending on what you guys have at home. But really, this is just to kind of remind our brain about this move. I think one of the most difficult things for young hitters, and we talked about it a little bit in the Get to Launch segment, is that idea of their lower half going forward as their top half works a little bit back. It's a tough thing for a young hitter to do, kind of with opposite movements. So these drills will help give you guys a little bit of a prep in terms of how they want their body to move before they get in the actual batter's box. And these are drills these guys can do every day to make sure that they're reminding their brain about the proper movements to get them set up to hold that scap. You see the swing rewind drill on the left here. This is kind of a drill we do to exaggerate scap load. Matt's basically going to start like his swing is finished and then push the rewind button. And this is kind of a progression we use where I'll start a hitter with this swing rewind drill because he has to move a lot to get into his scap. And at first, when we're trying to make this change, we want to make the hitter kind of exaggerate the movement a little bit. And then what we'll do is we'll get the hitter on the front shoulder load drill. And now that bat is on the front shoulder. So it's a little bit easier to get into that scap load, but it's still kind of a bigger move. Make sure when you're doing this with guys that bat comes right across their face when they go back and it doesn't drop down first. A lot of guys want to kind of let the head of the bat drop down and get really loopy. We want to feel our hands working back and rowing that elbow into that opposite dugout like we talked about. Our third part of our progression, now we put that bat basically between our eyes. So again, now it gets a little bit easier to get into that scapula. We don't need as big a move, but it's still forcing the player to move his hands as he goes forward. I talked about this in the Get to Launch protocol, but I really like drills where we're forcing young hitters to go back with their top half as their lower half goes forward. It's the reason a lot of our base drills do that. And then you see hook'ems here is kind of our easiest one where the bat is already on that back shoulder, and really all the hitter has to do is take it off and have more of a subtle row to engage that scap. But again, we're still working that lower half, making sure we're generating forward momentum as that top half begins to row back here. Lastly, couple of drills to help your player feel that next move. You see some bucket lid turns on the left. Matt going slow here, really clearing his hips before he slots in. And you'll see the same type of drill on the right where he's got a connection ball. And he's really making sure that he's engaged in that scap as you'll see his pelvis start to turn and then he starts to slot in. And all the connection ball does is help him feel the shape we want with that forearm and wrist, so we're not getting handsy or pushy or cutting across. And the bucket lid I really like because it kind of exaggerates that move where the hitter is trying to get that top palm up early as we begin to slot in. So some of this we'll talk about when we get to our swing depth protocol. There's crossover in everything we do here. Nothing happens independently in the baseball swing. But these are two examples that you can use to, once a player is feeling better about getting into his scap, to try and feel his hips start to rotate as he's maintaining that. When we do our evaluation on the video, a lot of guys never got into their scap to begin with, and that was an issue. But for the vast majority of our older guys, that I didn't give a great grade to on that. The vast majority of them go into it, but they do it early and they come out of it early. So, like I said, I like drills to help guys feel themselves get into it because it's a difficult move, and I like drills to have guys feel staying in it as their pelvis begins to rotate. Because, like I talked about earlier, that's really the money maker for me and the move that elite hitters make. So that is our scap load protocols. We'll move on to our lower half in the next segment. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.